Okay, that's fine. Yep, no problem.
And the recording starts. So at 10:15 or 11:15, you guys can go ahead and start talking.
Great, thank you.
In 1 minute. Okay. I'm going to put the Menti stuff into the
Okay, that'd be great.
And we're live.
Hey, welcome everybody. I know we have another minute before we get started. I just wanted to thank you for being here. All right, I see everybody still joining us. We'll give it just another 30 seconds or so and then get started. Again, thank you all for being here. We are, as we get ready to get started, for those of you that that are already in and settled, take a look in the chat. Maria has put in a link, and I'll explain it in just a moment. But for those of you that are already familiar with Menti, you'll see a Menti link in there. All right, Maria, you ready?
let's go.
All right, very good. All right, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to our session on fear-free fact-finding, that's even hard to say, conducting culture assessments. I'm John Truslow. Joining me is my partner in crime, Maria Sonnen, and we are both part of the ethics program at BA Systems, the part of BA Systems that is headquartered here in Southern New Hampshire. So I am sharing my screen. I hope you can all see that. We will be communicating with you also via the chat. And let's get started. This is us, right? This is what we look like in real life. I'm the Director of Ethics and Business Conduct, and Maria is the Ethics Program Manager. I've been at BA Systems for about 12 years now. And before coming to BA Systems, I was the Ethics Program Manager for XO Communications. And prior to that, I used to be at the U.S. Naval Academy working at their Center for the Study of Professional Military Ethics. That is relevant in that I learned a lot about what we do in assessment at the Naval Academy. The Naval Academy is very big on making sure that your tax dollars are spent in the right way and always evaluating and assessing how that money is being spent, even in the area of ethics and character development. Maria, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Sonnen, and I'm the Ethics Program Manager at the ES sector of BA Systems, working with John. I've been with BA Systems just about 4 years. In June, it'll be 4 years. Prior to BA Systems, I was with Compliance Week, and prior to that, I was staff at the ECI ECOA. A little bit about me.
Thank you. All right, we are going to start with a Menti question, but we'll be giving you the answers at the end. We'll show you everything that people have responded at the end, and we'll use that for the basis of our discussion at the end. If you've never used Menti before, it's really simple. You just use your phone, or you can use a browser just to log in to menti.com or access menti.com. You type in that code, and then you'll be asked the question that you see on the screen. What are your greatest challenges with assessing culture in your organizations? I'll leave that up just for a second. If you've never used Menti before, like I say, it's pretty simple. Just go to menti.com, type in the code that you see there. Maria's also put it in chat, and answer that question. You can do that anytime, and we'll leave up the question throughout our time together. And again, we'll show you the answers at the end. All right. Let me start by introducing the topic and what we're going to talk about today, by talking about what an assessment is, what I mean by assessment, and overall kind of the scope of our next hour. Oh, and before I do that, let me make an apology in advance. The slides that you see, we are going to be giving out. You'll be able to take all of the information that you find on these slides home with you, and that's what these slides were intended for. They were intended to be given out so that you have information that captures a lot of what Maria and I are going to talk about. But what that means is that there's a lot of information on each slide. Maria, who is a master at presentations, has argued again and again that we should be doing slides with very few words, and she is right. But these slides do have a lot of words, and I apologize. We're not going to read everyone or talk to everyone, but you will get all this information to take home with you. All right, so let's talk about what is an assessment and what we're going to talk about today. So an assessment is an ongoing process involving multiple instruments that results in a cycle of useful information. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that an assessment is not simply saying we wrote a survey and our assessment is the survey, right? An assessment is a process, and that process is what we'll be focused on for the next few minutes. I'll talk about what that process is. It's of multiple measures. A good assessment is not just one measure, it's multiple measures that are multiple instruments, that are implemented at multiple times throughout the process. And it results in a cycle of information. Information is constantly flowing, not just between you, and I'll just use the ethics office as shorthand for you, but the ethics office and the business, but between you, the employees, managers, HR, all the other functional leads, leadership, that information continues to flow. That's what an assessment is. The biggest value, and I think this is the biggest takeaway about assessments that I've picked up over the years, is that the biggest value of assessment to an organization comes from the implementation of that process. If you think of assessment and the main goal of an assessment to be the collection of data or getting all the data up on a slide, then I think you miss the overall benefit of doing an assessment. The best value you get is by incorporating other people into the implementation of that assessment. That's what we'll focus on today. An assessment, as you may have come to understand it, can be a very stressful situation for a lot of people. And you miss out on a lot of the value in doing an assessment if any part of that cycle, if any of the players, any of the stakeholders in that cycle of information have come to see it as a test, that you're here to evaluate them on how good a human being they are, or if they see it as an audit or something that's intended to embarrass them, then you've lost the real value, right? So it's not about collecting the data. It's not about playing a game of gotcha. It is about involving everyone in a process. So a fear-free assessment, what we're talking about today, is an assessment process in which every stakeholder is included in the process. So the design of what you're doing, the collection of the material, the analysis, the next steps, that everyone is involved in it. It's not a secret, it's not a surprise, it's not an evaluation in the kind of brutal sense of the word. In this way, what you're hoping for is that every stakeholder not only wants to be a part of the process, but wants to see the data that that process generates. Okay, so we're talking largely about assessing culture. So I felt that it was important just to go back and help you understand kind of the model with which we're talking when we talk about the assessment of culture and why that's important. The first general aspect, which I'm sure is kind of for this audience is probably a well understood idea, is that workplace culture deeply impacts all of our employees' decision making in the workplace. That's what a culture does, and that's generally why we care about it. If you want to improve that decision making, okay, if you want to reduce misconduct, that is, one significant aspect of reducing misconduct is getting information to local leaders and frontline managers, useful information. And in this way, it is information. It's not just hey, wouldn't you like to do better as a person? It is information that you give to these people to help identify very specific concerns, and it is the basis upon which you also propose solutions. But why do we give it to local leaders and to frontline managers? And the answer is because local leaders and frontline managers have a profound influence on workplace culture. Right? So there's our first example of the cycle. Local leaders and frontline managers have an impact on culture. Culture impacts decision-making. Decision-making, if you want information about decision-making, if you want to impact it, then give local leaders and frontline managers information about it. One of the things about culture that I think we all also understand that I won't dwell on is that workplace culture is not a thing that it can be measured at a moment in time. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing based on a new set of guidelines. It's changing based on a new contract or a new success or a scandal that may have happened in your company. It's constantly evolving. And it's based on behaviors of leadership, right? That culture is changing over time as managers change. But as behaviors of managers change, so does the culture. As the culture changes, so does different decisions that are being made by employees. And as that changes, then we need to go and collect more information to give to managers so they can change their behaviors, and the cycle repeats itself again. The visual model of what I'd like to talk about, and what we'll now go into some detail on, can be just described as a circle of information. And whenever you see this dotted line in our presentation, think of it as the flow of information as it goes round and round and round. And whenever you see the orange cloud in this example is culture. And within that culture, of course, are human beings, are people, local leaders, frontline managers, employees. These are the people that make up our workplace culture. What we'll talk about today are kind of 4 elements of how you get this cycle of information flowing. The first thing that we'll be talking about is how do you decide what information you actually need and deciding who has it? It's the first question you ask yourself. What information do we need, and who has that information if we're going to get it? Then after you've decided what information you want, then you go and select tools for collecting that information. The temptation, of course, is to pick the tool first and then say, well, what do we want to know? But that's the wrong way to go about it. First, decide the information that you want to collect and who has it, then select the tool based on that information. Then the third step is going to be making sense of the data that you have collected. And by making sense of it, we'll talk about how by involving your stakeholders, you get a much more enriched idea that you've collected, and then develop the tools and deploy tools to address the findings of your assessment. As you deploy those tools, it impacts the culture, and then you start all over again. Let me give you an example of one of the times that this has happened with us at BA Systems, where one of our one of our local ethics officers, what I know is often referred to as an ethics ambassador in some companies or others, one of our local ethics officers came and said that for her site, what she really wanted to do is she wanted a particular bit of information. And what she wanted to know is what is discouraging people in this site from speaking up about issues that arise. So we defined the problem as, or the question, the information that she needed as, when you have concerns in the workplace, what discourages you from speaking up? And it's all employees. It's not a subset, it's not a function, it's all the employees at this particular site. Then after we talked about it, we figured, what's a good non-invasive way to collect that information that you're looking for? And what she wanted to do was to set up a small Dropbox that would be at the entrance of her building with a question on it that changed, that eventually turned into one that changed every month. But people would, as they enter the building, they would write down the answers to the question, in this case, what discourages them from speaking up, and she put it inside, and people would put it inside the Dropbox. And then she went and worked with local HR partners, with the site leaders, with other people at that site, and said, look, this is the information that we've been collecting, and I want to talk with you about it and find out if this makes sense to you, if this is reasonable, is this a good collection of data or not, and what do you feel about it when you see it? And after that, this team of people now looking at the data decided, what we ought to do is give you an avenue for providing feedback to the culture by way of this site's monthly newsletter. So it turned into a regular thing where information was collected, by way of this Dropbox. It was discussed by site leaders and other people. The tool was used to feed back information to the culture and to talk about tips and tricks that people might use to overcome some of these obstacles, which affected the culture, and the process started all over again. I'll just give you another example very quickly. At BAE Systems in 2016, we started talking among a lot of the functional leaders about when we talk about pressure in the workplace, what are some of the pressures that people are experiencing in the workplace? And here we were starting to work with other leaders, even to develop our short surveys and focus groups. We worked with HR and we worked with safety and security and other functions to try to develop, like, what are the tools that we're going to use to collect this? And so they were standing by when we collected that information to try to make sense of it. And one of the avenues that we used as a result of that was to develop the theme and some of the associated scenarios for our annual ethics training. And of course, as our employees took the annual ethics training, then that impacted the culture and the process started again. So that's our model for today, these 4 steps that constantly feed information back into the culture. And for right now, what we're going to do is focus on this first one. What information do you need and who has it? And now I'm going to turn it over to Maria, who's going to focus on, at least initially, about awareness, that is the awareness that the culture might have, and then the culture itself.
Thanks, John. Can everyone see, can you see my screen, John?
Yes, I can.
Excellent, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment to talk, as John said, about the difference between collecting information on employee awareness and actually delving into questions about employees' experiences and thoughts about the culture of the organization. And I'm going to share with you a couple frameworks and question sets that John and I have developed, mostly John, but that we have developed to get to the culture questions. So employee awareness, pretty straightforward types of questions. This can often be accomplished with a survey, electronic or other. Very oftentimes they're binary questions, yes or no, and can be used when you want to quantify something or if you want to look at change over time. Some sample questions: do you know how to raise a concern? Do you know the helpline number? Do you know how to find the code of conduct? Are you familiar with the code of conduct? Do you know how to contact a local ethics representative? As John mentioned, we call them local ethics officers. Other people call them ambassadors, integrity leaders, etc. Are communications that you're receiving about ethics, are they useful to you? Are they pertinent? And then if what you're trying to get at is more around misconduct or ideas around retaliation and employees' experiences with that, you can ask questions about, have people been treated negatively for raising concerns? Are you aware of misconduct that has not been dealt with appropriately? Now, if you're just doing yes or no, these last 2 questions can be a little bit tough because, of course, if you're getting people answering, yes, I do know of misconduct, your next question is going to be, please tell me about that misconduct. And you can have, kind of short answers in these types of survey questions, but just be aware that you may not get all the information that you're looking for from that type of tool. So let's go ahead and talk about culture. Because oftentimes you're not just looking for kind of statistical type of data, you're looking for employees' feelings and thoughts and experiences with the culture of the organization. And these types of questions are often best in an open-ended type of question. Can be done with a survey, electronic. John mentioned the Dropbox survey, which is a great way to get employees to submit information. Can also be, these types of questions are often lend themselves to interviews or focus groups. And a few things to think about when you are asking these types of open-ended questions about culture, you need to make sure that you clarify whether you're asking the individuals that you're speaking with about things that are unique to their own experience, or if you're asking them to project the experiences of a larger group of people or other people in their work groups. Another thing to think about is to be clear when you're asking these questions about culture. Are you defining the culture as the whole organizational culture? So in our case, BAE systems, or are you asking them about a smaller subset? Are you asking about their small work group or their local, site, or their people who work under their manager? A couple things to keep in mind. So there's lots and lots of different ways to think about culture. We've come up with kind of we've looked at these 5 frameworks and created some suggested questions for culture assessments from each of these models. These aren't the only models that you can use. There's certainly other models out there, and these are not the only questions that come out of these models. So this is just something to kind of spark your imagination and your thoughts about culture assessments. One thing to note is that you don't have to ask every single question within a model, and you don't have to limit yourself to one model. We've sometimes done assessments where we've picked questions from different models and even added unique questions that are not in these models for a particular work group based on what we're trying to get at. So the first model that we use, or first framework that we use to think about culture assessments, is the fraud triangle. I think everyone on the call is probably very familiar with the fraud triangle. Pressure and opportunity and rationalization are often can lead to misconduct. So some questions that you might want to ask if you're looking to see what type of pressure influence pressure can have on people in misconduct and their thoughts about the culture. Describe a time when someone cut a corner and what was the pressure. Can you tell me about a time where someone was rewarded for cutting that corner, and what does that look like? Opportunity, of course. I think one of the best questions here are, if misconduct were to occur here in this work group, how could it be hidden? How could it be uncovered? So what are there opportunities for individuals to do misconduct? And rationalization. One of the questions here that you might want to think about is, what are justifications you hear for people cutting corners or doing the wrong thing? Is it because, everyone around here does it that way, or I didn't have another choice, that due date was coming up? So, these are some questions that you might want to use if you think about if you use this model. The next model is the integrity index, which has 7 factors that lead to a culture of integrity, and some questions that might come out of that. The first factor is comfort speaking up. So you might want to ask, what are some reasons you might not tell someone about a concern? You might not speak up to your manager. Trust in colleagues. Your direct manager's leadership. Why do you trust or not trust your manager? How does your manager demonstrate respect? Tone at the top. What is important to leadership in this organization? How are those priorities demonstrated? Clarity of expectations. How do you know what the right thing is in a given situation? Does your leadership and management make those expectations clear? Openness of communication. And the last one is organizational justice. And I think this is a great question that you can ask to get at that aspect of organizational justice and fairness. Give me a real life example of 2 employees being held to different standards or treated differently. So the next one is psychological safety. And a quick note about this framework, this is actually one that works very well, both in a open-ended, so focus group or one-on-one interview type of setting, as well as a survey where you're asking people to rate on a scale. So John and I have done this before, including we've done it using Menti, where we've had people, kind of on a scale of 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 or whatever type of scale you want to use. How do you feel about these statements that make up, these 7 statements that make up Amy Edmondson's psychologically safe culture or work group? And the first one is, if you made a mistake on this team, it's often held against you. And turning that into a question, if you're doing it more in a open-ended, interactive type of focus group, how are good faith mistakes handled on your team? Members of this team are able to bring up problems and tough issues. People on this team sometimes reject others for being different. It is safe to take a risk on this team. Difficult to ask for help. And no one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. And working with members of this team, my unique skills and talents are valued. So one thing to note is that some of these are posed more in the negative and some more in the positive. So you might have to flip some of these questions around a bit to make them match what you're trying to accomplish. So the next one is the Great Place to Work, the trust model. In this model, trust is a composite of 5 different attributes: credibility, fact, fairness, camaraderie, and pride. And here are some examples of questions that you might want to ask employees if you're using this model. And as John mentioned before, we are going to be sharing these slides, so you'll all have access to these. I'm not going to go through each of them. And then another way is with the ECI's own high-quality program model. And in this particular model, culture is highly influenced by leadership behaviors. And these leadership behaviors are called ethics-related actions, and they're based on the 3rd principle of the HPQ, which is leaders at all levels across the organization build and sustain a culture of integrity. So a few questions that you might want to use if you're looking at these leadership behaviors is does your leadership discuss ethics often, the principles, the values, expectations? Does your leadership consider these when making decisions? Does your leadership keep promises and commitments to employees, but also to customers or other business partners? Does your leadership keep people informed about what is happening in the company? Is there transparency and openness from the leadership with the employees? And does your leadership support employees in following the organization's standards? Now, one thing to note is that these behaviors are important not just at the leadership or at the top, but very important at middle management, the direct manager, and even the way coworkers treat each other. And if what you're trying to look at in your assessment is employees' thoughts and perspectives on, for example, their direct manager or their middle management or the business leadership, business unit leadership, you can adapt these questions to those various groups and get maybe a different type of perspective from the employees. So those are the models. And before I turn it back over to John to talk about tools, I just want to say a really quick note about collaboration. And I really think, and John touched upon this in the beginning, but I think that this is so incredibly important because if you are not collaborating effectively, You are not going to really potentially understand exactly what you're looking for. You're not going to get the support that you need to move forward, to actually do the surveys or the focus groups, or take the time, employees' time away from their day jobs to spend time with you to talk about culture. And the results that you get may not be accepted by the customers of that, or the consumers of that information. So do not do this all by yourself. Although, you know, I'm sure everyone on this call is more than capable of doing an assessment. So important to make sure that you get that buy-in from other people, that you are looking at that whole process, that whole circle that John showed earlier, and figuring out who are the people that you need to be working with in each of those various points. One thing I think that's important is talk to other functions, especially HR, about cases or trends that they have seen recently, alongside the data that you collect in your own ethics function. That can be invaluable to kind of decide what exactly do we want to assess, what are some of our cultural concerns. And here are a few questions to ask yourself. Are you may be interested in a particular aspect of culture, but are your partners in this process, managers, HR, local leadership, other functional leads, are they interested in getting that information? Do they have other information that they want to collect? Are they already conducting some type of assessment? Is there a survey already going on that you can kind of insert questions into? Are they interested? Are they looking forward to hearing what you have to find? Or do they feel like you're sneaking around and trying to get them in trouble? How are they going to react to hearing potentially bad news? And how would you feel being in the shoes of the employees being asked these assessment questions? And what are some of the things that you can do in your ethics role to build trust, not just with these other functions and managers and leaders that you're going to be collaborating with, but with the employees themselves? So I'm going to turn it back over to John now to talk about tools.
You say that like it's an easy thing to do. So hold on just a second and I will.
No worries.
Oh, there it is. Okay. Sorry about that. Maria, can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. We only work with Zoom every day of our lives all the time. How we can't still do that is probably says something on me. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Maria. Maria was just going over the kind of what information do you need and who has it. And now I'm going to be focusing on this part over here, which is selecting the tools that collect that information. So we'll be talking about surveys, interviews, and focus groups. I know a lot of you have done these kinds of things before, but some of you, I understand, really haven't. And so in some ways, this is just going to be some collected thoughts on both of these that give you some idea of what we mean to involve other people in the development of these tools. So first, let's talk about surveys, which seems to be the kind of the go-to for most people. But surveys are best used when you want to measure the level of employee awareness. So Maria talked a lot about awareness. When you want to measure the level of that awareness about particular things, or the extent or the degree to which employees believe or agree with something, then a survey very well may be a good idea. I think a lot of the best surveys really are these kind of yes/no questions or rate on a scale, maybe short answers, but short answers, if they are deployed, are usually deployed so that you get greater insight so that you can ask other questions and other tools later on down the road. There are, unfortunately, a lot of obstacles to doing a good survey. and we run across these all the time whenever we're trying to do surveys. The first is just the basic logistics of it, whether or not it's going to be done digitally, whether or not it's going to be done, some portion of it may have to be done manually on paper. How do you handle all that? You have to also consider the time that's spent. Those of us that work in defense or that are otherwise government contractors, you know that we are our time is a large part of how we make our money, is spending our time. And so our managers and our leadership are very hesitant to give up any of that time to take surveys. Employees concerned about privacy and anonymity. This is something that we struggle with all the time when we do surveys. And we take it into account when we're talking about the tool, when we talk about the platform for that tool, when we talk about how we communicate about that tool. But employees' concerns about privacy and anonymity are so important because they will ultimately affect the quality of the data that you receive. General concerns about how the data will be used, reported, et cetera. What I mean by that is, unfortunately, and I've worked for many organizations, I'm not speaking specifically about BAE, but I've worked for many organizations where data is collected from employees but is not really used. It's not fed back to the employees. It's not used to generate new ideas or new tools. But how that information is used, how information from a survey is used or not used or published or printed also should be taken into account because it affects the quality of the data you collect. And then also surveys, depending on the pool of people that you are surveying, may or may not be statistically significant. And this is one of those things that is kind of peculiar to me, where when you're creating a survey, there are a lot of people that want to talk about doing a survey and wanting to get information. But once you start presenting it, at least in an engineering organization like BAE Systems, people immediately start asking the question, oh, I don't like the answer there. Is it statistically significant? So unfortunately, it's a question that's often raised after the fact and not before, but you could solve a lot of problems by thinking that through ahead of time. I'm going to talk a little bit about preparation for focus groups or one-on-one interviews. And because it is the process of preparing to do a focus group is largely the work. That's the heavy lifting that goes into it. And if you prepare correctly, then the rest of it is actually a lot easier. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing this, if you've selected a focus group or interviews as your tool, then please know going in, they do not produce statistically valid results. They just don't. The conditions under which you receive this information vary even from focus group to focus group or interview to interview. You are not getting statistically valid data. That may not be a problem. In fact, I still really prefer this method over a lot of others. But you have to acknowledge going in that it won't withstand the scrutiny, statistical scrutiny. You'll have to know that up front in how you present it. When you're preparing to do a focus group or an interview, the real fundamental orienting principle is a question, and that is, how do we create a safe environment in which people actually want to give us honest, constructive feedback? So that's the one question. How do you provide that safe environment? If anything about the environment, anything at all about a focus group or interview environment makes the person feel unsafe, you're not going to get good information. But with all of that in mind, then keeping the kind of what you're trying to find out, and then as you prepare, here are some things you might want to do as you prepare. The first is to actually develop a question set that you will ask each and every time that you, at least to start, that you'll ask a focus group or interview. You don't really need that many. For an hour-long focus group, maybe only 5 to 6 questions is all you need. If you've set everything up correctly and people really are there to talk, 5 or 6 questions is more than enough. Perhaps the same for a 30-minute one-on-one interview, maybe 5 or 6 questions. Of course, you should allow yourself the leeway and the flexibility to go into other questions in other areas that aren't brought up, but starting with a question set is a really good idea. You have to decide as you prepare for these focus groups who's going to be in the room and who picks who's in the room, right? Is this a targeted population you want to know from this group? Is it some random selection from a much, much larger group? Are you trying to focus on specific functions or teams? Are you trying to find out something about a particular work environment maybe? And then keeping that in mind, you have to consider, all right, of the people in the room, are we going to control for things like reporting relationships, right? Are the managers going to be in the same room as their subordinates? And what would that do in this particular case, given the information that you want to ask? Does that matter in the data collection process? And then, again, you should always be partnered with other people as you're preparing. Maybe this is one way that HR can help you in terms of identifying and selecting and knowing something about the participants before they are in the room with you. How many? Well, if you're doing a focus group, 10 is about a number that we find to be pretty good. You'll need to invite a few more probably to get 10. But at least in our experience, we find that anything more than 10, you have a lot of people that just hide and be quiet, and fewer than 10, you're not getting a breadth of data being shared with you. So about 10. Hey, where is actually one of the most overlooked questions when you're setting up a focus group, because a lot of times you don't have a whole lot of choice. When Maria and I visit sites and want to do focus groups, sometimes the site is so small, there is only one place to do it. But if you have a choice, thinking through where it is and what the participants will experience when they go to this place is worth your time. Is the space private? Who else can see people in the room while they're talking? Can the conversation be overheard by people in the next room, or will participants perceive that it could be overheard in the next room? Can you provide refreshments as a way of welcoming people and making them feel at home? And then how do you invite them? Do you maybe set several communications to try to help people feel comfortable that this is not about them? And we're not, when you show up, we're not going to be asking about you. Maybe a broad communication early on to the whole site, letting them know that these focus groups are going to be conducted, and then inviting people with a very personal note, giving them the opportunity to ask questions of you in advance before they even show up. But the important principle here is demonstrate transparency as you invite these individuals as to what they're going to get into. And then do have a plan for documenting or taking notes. A lot of times in our field, I know we like to have a second person in the room. That is my preferred way of doing it, but a second person in the room very well could intimidate people. It adds a whole nother dynamic when you have another person in the room that isn't a regular participant. But of course, some states and some companies like ours have very strict or even prohibited rules around recording. So you may not be able to record. And if it's just you taking notes, that's time that you're not spent focused on listening to what's being said. So do consider a plan for documenting and taking notes. All right, now just some quick thoughts on executing a focus group or interview. Getting started is kind of the hardest part, I think, when you're executing a focus group, but I always begin by setting some very clear ground rules. Even if it takes a few minutes, it's better. It helps put people at ease and gives them a greater framework and context for what you're asking about. I always explain to the participants that we really do value their participation and insights, and I demonstrate that, or at least I help to reinforce that by telling them how I expect their input is going to be used. And again, maybe this is just an environment that Maria and I are more familiar with, but a lot of times people have been invited to focus groups many times, and they really just want to know that if they're going to take the risk and go to all that effort, that you're really going to actually do something with their effort. And so trying to help them have a sense up front of what that is, I think would help. Help them understand that you're not going to attribute anything outside of that room to a single individual, and none of the specific examples that you hear. Just in general, you're just going to be sharing general thoughts and general observations. If you are recording or taking notes, please explain how you're going to be doing that. You also lay out up front that focus group is not a place for people to report an incident of misconduct. You can even talk about it, and we do at the beginning and end, show people our ethics helpline and give them avenues for that, but we let them know up front that it's not for the focus group space. We do ask people in the room to also respect the confidentiality of people in the room by not repeating anything that they've heard there. We do kind of go over these rules not only at the outset, but also at the end to try to remind people of the general parameters of the focus group. And then all I can say is, depending on your question set and depending on how you set up the room and who's in it, it's all going to be kind of different from that point forward. But the most important thing, maybe most obviously, is demonstrating good listening skills. Don't give in, and I've seen this happen when some of our local ethics officers have done focus groups. Don't give in to the temptation to repeat or to qualify questions too much. In other words, if you participate too much, if you show that you're willing to exert yourself too much, people will pull back. And so what you want to do is ask your question and let it sit. In the facilitation world, sometimes that's called the standing 8 count. But you literally sit silently for 8 seconds until the pressure in the room builds. Someone will answer, almost guaranteed in 8 seconds. Demonstrating active listening is sort of obvious in a focus group or interview, but it's also not easy. So I just want to remind you of what I mean by exhibiting active listening skills. First, just always, of course, given who you are, you're probably already monitoring voice and body language of participants. You, of course, want to give attention to the person speaking. And this means even if you are taking notes, watch the person while they're speaking and then take your notes after they've finished speaking. Don't leave any ambiguity about whether or not you actually are paying attention to the speaker. Don't judge. You want to reflect. Don't judge what people say. Reflect back to them what you think you heard them say. I have seen people in facilitated sessions actually say, well, that is a dumb thing to say, right? And that from that moment on, as soon as the facilitator of a focus group has judged something in the room, you're not going to get any useful data after that point. Simply reflect back to people what you've heard. It helps them feel understood or helps them feel heard. And it also helps you to clarify, yep, that is really, I have heard what this person is, and I'll make a note about that particular item. Your speaking should be minimal in a focus group or interview. You only want to speak just enough to let people know that you're still actively engaged, but you want to say as little as possible. And really, as I said before, silence is your friend in an interview and focus group. Allow for, if you've set a good safe parameter and you know that the people in the room feel that they can be safe, it is okay for you to introduce silence as a way of motivating their responses. And it does work. All right, for our last 2 topics here, it's really just a very short, because after you've gotten to this point, it really does kind of depend on what comes next. But in our last slide or 2, I'll be focused on this area, which is, all right, now that you've collected the data from a survey, an interview, or focus group, or however you've collected it, then how do we make sense of the data that we've collected? And then what are the tools that we are going to develop and deploy as a result of it? And since this is kind of the back end of the assessment, it's also our shortest portion for today. So when you finished your data intake and summarized, gotten kind of stripped it clean of any personally identifiable information, then you want to start the process of sharing it and discussing it with a range of stakeholders. If you've done your job correctly, though, you've already been engaging them in the process. You've engaged HR in the development of the tool. You've engaged managers in the development of your tools. They have been on the forefront of the tool. And so if you've done that properly, then they are looking forward to finding out what you have learned in the process. So that's the fear-free portion of our conversation today, is just reminding you that if you have engaged people in the development of the tool, or even in the collection of the data, then they are looking forward to hearing what you found. And that's where I think a lot of assessment efforts break down. Mostly what happens is you find people writing the surveys in secret, not sharing them with anybody, surprising some population that wasn't ready for it, and then taking the data and surprising the managers for whom you're now going to ask to go do something. Okay? And at any one of those stages, the process has broken down. But again, as I say, the next steps begin, hopefully, with people ready to look at the data and wanting to see it. I also encourage you to share this data, especially survey data, but any kind of data, share it broadly. I don't know if they do it still, but there was a huge defense contractor in our industry that used to, after they would do a survey, they would give access to the raw data in a tool. It was a tool that prevented, you finding out like down to the, to individual people, and that there were certain limits on it. But they allowed their entire population to go into this tool and run their own analysis of the data and to share their findings. And of course, since they were a defense company with a lot of engineers, people thought of things to do with that data and conclusions that they could draw from that data that the ethics team never would have imagined. So again, my emphasis here is share it broadly with as many people as you can within the limits of what you promised to the participants. right? When you are going back to stakeholders, when you're going back initially to managers and to HR partners and other leaders, resist the urge to give too much of your own slant on it, your own take. What you really want to do is just say, I have found this, or when surveyed or when I asked them in a focus group, people said this, and without too much of your spin on it, and ask them for their reaction to it. They may not like it, they may not agree with it, but that will give them an opportunity to respond honestly and actively. And then ask them, as you're talking with them, if this was true, what would you want to do about it? Start getting them thinking about, well, I may not like what I've seen here, but okay, if we do come to a conclusion that this is what our employees think, or these are the obstacles, or these are the pressures, or this is the issue that we need to address, get them thinking about how they might fix it, how they might go about changing something about their own behavior or the company's behavior to fix it. Okay, this is a little bit of a review, but, or I guess this is kind of forward and back, but the forward piece is when you are thinking about the next steps, when you're thinking about how do we use this data, develop those tools with a problem, an audience, and a solution in mind. The problem may have been identified by your assessment. The audience may be different than the people you got it from. They may have observations about other things, but develop your tools with a problem, an audience, that is who you're targeting, and then the solution, the end state, the goal of what you're trying to do in mind. These are the questions I always ask myself, and they are, what do I want people to know? What do I want them to do? Or how do I want them to believe something different than what they do today? And what's the right tool to encourage that? Is it some sort of organizational development tool? Is it training? Is it an interactive education or interactive activity? Is it some type of communication? What kind, and who is it being targeted to? So again, I know that all of this is going to be different based on what findings you come up with, which is why we're not going into detail here. But do develop those tools with a problem, a specific audience, and a solution in mind, and you're well on your way. Okay, Maria, would you like to take it from here?
I sure can. Okay, so just a reminder for anyone who hasn't had a chance to vote, or not vote, but add their comments. Menti.com, the code is there on the screen. And if you've had thoughts that have come up while we've been talking, even if you've already done something in Menti, you can answer more than once. So please do go in and put your thoughts. We're going to share those in just 1 minute. Before that, I want to very quickly just leave you with a few key takeaways. I know we've given lots of information. Again, we're going to be sharing these slides, but a few key takeaways that John and I thought you might want to really think about. Don't go it alone. I think that's probably the number one key takeaway that both John and I have been talking about. Rely on collaboration. Get that buy-in. Assessment is an ongoing process. It's not one event. You just don't do, oh, we've assessed everyone, we're all set. It is an ongoing process, referring back to that circular assessment process that John was showing on the screen. Anonymous surveys, or if you're going to go the survey route, anonymous is best because people, are more comfortable sharing thoughts anonymously oftentimes. But make sure that if you do want to slice and dice that data with demographics, that you have those questions in there. When you're doing focus groups, think about who's in the room really thoughtfully. Probably not a great idea to have the manager there with their direct reports and asking the direct reports questions about the manager. But are you going to be mixing and matching functions? Are you going to have people from different levels in the organization? So really think about that. Put yourself in the shoes of the people who have the information that you want. But as I mentioned before, if you're going to use some of those framework questions that we're going to share with you, you can mix and match them and even add novel questions that are unique to aspects of your culture that you're trying to get more information about. Use information to identify concerns and propose solutions. and back to that slide that John just shared, to inform that continual assessment model. And don't ever have a gotcha or ethics knows best type of attitude. Everyone in your organization cares about culture, and everyone in your organization has a stake in the culture of that organization. And you can best prevent this type of feeling if you've done that proper collaboration and buy-in and involving everyone in the process. And you are then seen as a valuable partner. So what I want to do right now, John, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on this, or if you want me to just go ahead and share the.
Yeah, go ahead and share. No, thank you. No, thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, so these are the results from Menti. I hope everybody can see it. There's two things, John, I think that we really want to go ahead and talk about. And one is constricted travel, right? For focus groups, one-on-one, this in-person, what used to be much easier done in person. And, even post-COVID, I know at BA Systems, a lot of employees are coming back into the office. But post-COVID, there's a lot of employees who are now hybrid or fully remote. It's really changed. COVID kind of changed the workplace for a lot of organizations. And there's a lot of organizations out there, even pre-COVID, that had a really geographically dispersed population. So, doing those focus groups let's talk about focus groups. Doing focus groups in this type of Zoom setting, it is challenging. I think that one thing that John and I have experienced is you really have to bring it to a much smaller number, right? So if before you had 10 people sitting in a room, maybe you're only doing it with 4 people on a Zoom, and you're choosing people that already have relationships, right? So that they're not just strange picture faces on a Zoom, and encouraging people to use their make sure they're using their cameras and you have a platform for engagement. John, do you have any other thoughts on, how to do this virtually?
No, other than to say, of course, we do struggle with it. And I certainly feel for everyone in the ethics and compliance world when we've talked about culture for so long, and now culture itself, like I don't even know exactly how to define culture in a virtual world. So assessing it does become harder, and the tools like surveys and focus groups become harder. So it is, I guess I just want to empathize with the folks that have said that. It is in fact much harder, even to know what it is you're looking to assess. Your point, Maria, I think is the best one that I could possibly have, which is smaller for us has proven to be better, that instead of 10, maybe 2 or 3 is actually kind of where we find people still feel that they can have a trusted dialogue with somebody without also hiding. So smaller groups for focus groups, and it is hard. So I guess I don't want to claim any wisdom here. It's a tough one that we're also struggling with.
Yeah, I think oftentimes also if if you're looking at a location-based type of survey group, if you have people who are on site, if you're not able to travel because of various restrictions, are there people on site that you can leverage? In ethics or even HR. Speaking of HR. There's a comment here about 2 or 3 that are kind of related. So support to do separate culture assessments, not just the HR issues, and doing culture assessments when it's kind of owned by, quote unquote, by HR. So do you have any thoughts on that, John, on how to?
No, a point you made earlier I think applies here, and that is that a couple of points that you made earlier. One is simply that culture, a lot of organizations feel that they own culture, and involving them in the process, I think tries to kill several birds with one stone, right? But Security would tell you that they're all about culture. Quality at our organization would tell you that they're all about culture. HR and a lot of organizations say that they're all about culture. But having a collaborative approach to even define it is a good example of what I meant at the outset by saying, by collaborating together to define it, that's the implementation of the assessment process that has the most value, right? In other words, sitting down with quality and HR and security and safety to talk about what is the culture we want and how do we want to find out information about it. That part is actually as important, if not more important, than going out and collecting it. I know that a lot of our organizations, maybe more to the question, a lot of our organizations do feel awfully siloed at times, and different people within those organizations want to take a tool or an effort like assessment of culture and go off and run with it, leaving others behind. But my goal has always been, if the ethics group is going to do it, we're going to involve others and we're going to collaborate, because that is breaking down those silos, maybe by way of an assessment process, involving people in the process. Breaking down silos is one of the ways that the ethics program adds value to the organization.
Yeah, thanks. So there's also a couple, and I know we're just about out of time, but there's also a couple thoughts that are coming through here on, really employees being nervous about the confidentiality of what you're doing. And I think, and lack of trust. And I think it's just so important that, as John mentioned, that you're, upfront and honest with employees about, what you're doing, why you're doing it, what you're going to do with the data, what their engagement will be post focus group, and, making sure that you're not doing things in the focus group that can lead people to believe, or asking follow-up questions that could lead people to believe that, they might get in trouble or something like that for something that they're saying.
Okay.
So I think that slide that John presented about, how to actually conduct the focus group will really help with some of the trust issues. But
we're getting the hook. Yeah, we are getting the hook. I just wanted to thank you. I wanted to thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for all your help with this, and thank you to the hosts and to all of you for being here. Maria and I, like I said, we'll share our slides. We love interacting with you and with the field. So certainly, if you have any questions or thoughts or things you want to talk with us about, we look forward to hearing from you by email or phone anytime into the future. So with that, thank you again. Thanks for being here.
Ditto. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.